Looking at the data from August 2025, we find ourselves confronting a deeply complex situation where over 254 individuals identifying as Jehovah's Witnesses are currently imprisoned across multiple nations. The reasons for their incarceration fall primarily into two categories: conscientious objection to military service and engagement in religious activities deemed illegal by their respective governments. This raises profound questions about the intersection of religious freedom, civil duty, and state authority that deserve careful examination without rushing to judgment. The geographic distribution tells an interesting story. Russia holds the largest number with 157 prisoners, all detained for religious activities. This follows Russia's 2017 decision to ban Jehovah's Witnesses as an extremist organization, a move that has been widely criticized by international human rights organizations. The Russian government argues that the organization undermines traditional family values and poses a threat to social cohesion, while defenders point out that peaceful religious practice should never be criminalized in a society that claims to respect freedom of conscience. The situation in Russia represents the most systematic approach to restricting this religious group's activities among the nations listed. Eritrea presents another significant case with 64 individuals imprisoned, detained for both conscientious objection and religious activities. The Eritrean context is particularly harsh, as the country has maintained one of the most restrictive religious policies globally, recognizing only 4 religious groups and requiring indefinite national service from its citizens. Some of these Jehovah's Witnesses have been imprisoned for decades, with reports of harsh conditions and limited access to family or legal representation. The government maintains that national service is essential for the country's survival and development, while critics argue that indefinite conscription amounts to forced labor and violates basic human rights. The situation in Crimea, with 14 imprisoned, reflects the complex political reality following Russia's annexation of the peninsula in 2014. These individuals face the application of Russian law regarding extremist organizations in a territory whose legal status remains disputed internationally. Ukraine itself holds 7 Jehovah's Witnesses for conscientious objection, highlighting how even countries facing active military conflicts struggle with balancing security needs against individual conscience rights. The ongoing war has intensified debates about military service obligations, with some arguing that defending one's country is a moral imperative, while others maintain that forced military service violates fundamental human dignity. Singapore and South Korea, with 8 and 2 prisoners respectively, both detained for conscientious objection, represent developed democracies grappling with mandatory military service requirements. South Korea has actually made significant progress in recent years, establishing an alternative civilian service program for conscientious objectors following landmark court decisions. The fact that only 2 remain in prison suggests a transition period as the new system is implemented. Singapore continues to maintain its stance that national service is essential for the small nation's defense, though debates about alternative service continue within civil society. The theological dimension adds another layer of complexity to this discussion. Jehovah's Witnesses base their stance on biblical passages such as Jesus' statement that his followers should be no part of the world, interpreting this to mean political neutrality and non-participation in warfare. They cite scriptures about beating swords into plowshares and loving one's enemies as foundational to their beliefs. Critics within and outside religious communities question whether such absolute interpretations are necessary or whether they represent an organizational position that goes beyond biblical requirements. Some argue that defending one's community or serving one's country in non-combat roles could be compatible with Christian principles, while Jehovah's Witnesses maintain that any participation in military structures compromises their spiritual stance. The organizational response from the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, the legal entity used by Jehovah's Witnesses, emphasizes their members' law-abiding nature in all matters that don't conflict with their understanding of divine law. They point to their history of peaceful resistance, their contributions to religious freedom jurisprudence through numerous court cases, and their consistent stance across different countries and political systems. The organization provides legal support to imprisoned members and actively documents cases of persecution, working with international human rights bodies to advocate for their members' release. However, some former members and critics raise questions about whether the organization's strict stance on these issues allows for individual conscience and decision-making. They point to the severe social consequences within the community for those who choose military service or political participation, including potential shunning by family and friends. This raises ethical questions about whether organizational pressure might compromise genuine individual conscience, and whether the community's response to dissent aligns with the biblical principles of love and forgiveness they espouse. The international legal framework provides important context for evaluating these imprisonments. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights both recognize freedom of thought, conscience, and religion as fundamental rights. The UN Human Rights Committee has specifically stated that the right to conscientious objection to military service derives from these freedoms. Many democratic nations have developed alternative service programs that respect conscientious objection while still requiring citizens to contribute to society. The European Court of Human Rights has ruled repeatedly that imprisonment for conscientious objection violates human rights when no genuine alternative service is available. Yet governments defending these imprisonments argue that they have legitimate interests in national security, social cohesion, and equal treatment of citizens. They point out that exempting certain groups from civic duties could create resentment and undermine social solidarity. Some argue that if religious exemptions are granted too broadly, it could lead to others claiming similar exemptions for non-religious philosophical reasons, potentially undermining essential state functions. The challenge lies in balancing individual freedom with collective needs, a tension that has existed throughout human history. The personal stories behind these numbers reveal the human cost of these conflicts between conscience and state authority. Many of those imprisoned are young men facing the prime years of their lives behind bars. Families are separated, careers are disrupted, and individuals face psychological and sometimes physical hardship. Yet many of these prisoners express a sense of purpose and conviction, viewing their imprisonment as a form of witnessing to their faith. Their supporters see them as prisoners of conscience deserving international advocacy, while critics might view them as individuals who chose to break legitimate laws and must face consequences. The COVID pandemic added another dimension to these imprisonments, as confined conditions increased health risks for prisoners. Some countries released certain categories of prisoners to reduce overcrowding, but many Jehovah's Witnesses remained incarcerated. This raised questions about proportionality in punishment and whether maintaining these imprisonments during a public health crisis was justifiable. Human rights organizations documented cases where imprisoned Jehovah's Witnesses were denied adequate medical care or faced increased isolation during pandemic restrictions. Looking at historical precedents provides additional perspective on current situations. Jehovah's Witnesses faced severe persecution during Nazi Germany, with thousands sent to concentration camps for refusing military service and allegiance to the state. They were marked with purple triangles and given opportunities to renounce their faith and gain release, which most refused. This historical experience shapes the community's identity and their view of current imprisonments as part of a longer pattern of persecution. Critics might argue that comparing modern democratic states to Nazi Germany is inappropriate, and that legitimate legal requirements shouldn't be equated with totalitarian persecution. The economic implications of these imprisonments extend beyond individual suffering. Removing productive members from society represents a loss of human capital and economic contribution. The costs of imprisonment, legal proceedings, and enforcement also burden state resources. Some economists argue that alternative service programs, where conscientious objectors contribute through civilian work, provide better outcomes for both individuals and society. Countries that have implemented such programs report general satisfaction with the results, though challenges remain in ensuring equal burden sharing among citizens. The role of international diplomacy and pressure varies significantly across these cases. Western democracies have been vocal in criticizing Russia's treatment of Jehovah's Witnesses, incorporating it into broader human rights dialogues. However, responses to conscientious objection imprisonment in allied nations like Singapore or South Korea tend to be more muted, raising questions about consistency in human rights advocacy. Some argue this reflects realpolitik and strategic considerations, while others maintain that different contexts require different approaches. Within the Jehovah's Witness community itself, these imprisonments serve multiple functions. They reinforce group identity and commitment, provide contemporary examples of faithfulness under trial, and validate the organization's interpretation of biblical prophecy about persecution in the last days. The community's literature frequently features stories of imprisoned members, presenting them as modern-day examples of faithful endurance. This creates a powerful narrative that strengthens internal cohesion while potentially making it more difficult for individual members to express doubts or choose different paths. The psychological impact on imprisoned individuals varies considerably based on personal conviction, support systems, and prison conditions. Some report finding strength through prayer and correspondence with fellow believers, maintaining their conviction throughout imprisonment. Others struggle with isolation, doubt, and the practical challenges of life after release. The long-term effects of imprisonment on mental health, family relationships, and social reintegration deserve careful consideration when evaluating the proportionality of these punishments. The question of children and minors adds another sensitive dimension to this issue. In some cases, young Jehovah's Witnesses face imprisonment shortly after reaching legal adulthood, having been raised with strong convictions about military service. This raises questions about informed consent, the age at which individuals should face such consequences, and whether special considerations should apply to those whose beliefs were formed during childhood within a highly structured religious environment. Some argue that society should protect young people from facing severe consequences for beliefs instilled by their upbringing, while others maintain that religious convictions deserve respect regardless of their origin. The digital age has transformed how these cases gain international attention and support. Social media campaigns, online petitions, and digital advocacy have amplified voices calling for the release of imprisoned Jehovah's Witnesses. However, governments restricting these religious activities also use digital surveillance and control to monitor and prosecute religious activities, creating a technological arms race between religious freedom advocates and state control apparatus. The ability to document and share evidence of persecution has increased, but so has the capacity for states to track and prosecute religious activities they deem illegal. Legal scholars debate whether the right to conscientious objection should be absolute or subject to limitations. Some argue that genuine religious conviction should always excuse individuals from military service, while others maintain that states can legitimately require alternative service that doesn't involve weapons or combat. The nature and duration of alternative service become crucial factors, with human rights bodies generally holding that alternative service shouldn't be punitive in nature or duration. The challenge lies in creating systems that respect conscience while maintaining fairness and meeting legitimate state needs. The response of other religious communities to these imprisonments varies considerably. Some religious leaders and organizations express solidarity with imprisoned Jehovah's Witnesses, seeing their struggle as part of broader religious freedom concerns. Others remain silent or even critical, perhaps disagreeing with Jehovah's Witnesses' theological positions or organizational practices. This lack of unified religious response potentially weakens advocacy efforts and raises questions about interreligious solidarity in the face of state restrictions on religious freedom. Cultural factors significantly influence how different societies view these imprisonments. In countries with strong military traditions or recent experiences of conflict, conscientious objection may be seen as unpatriotic or cowardly. In societies that prioritize individual freedom and religious diversity, imprisonment for religious conviction appears more troubling. These cultural differences complicate international dialogue about human rights and make universal standards difficult to implement. Understanding local contexts becomes essential for effective advocacy and policy development. The gender dimension of this issue deserves attention, as most imprisoned Jehovah's Witnesses are men due to male-only conscription in most countries. This raises questions about gender equality in civic duties, and whether the burden of conscience conflicts falls disproportionately on men. Some feminists argue for equal conscription or universal civic service, while others see male-only conscription as discriminatory. The intersection of religious freedom and gender equality creates complex ethical and legal questions that societies continue to grapple with. Educational initiatives within the Jehovah's Witness community prepare young members for potential imprisonment, teaching them about their legal rights, providing practical advice for facing detention, and reinforcing theological reasons for their stance. Critics argue this constitutes indoctrination that limits genuine choice, while supporters see it as necessary preparation for religious persecution. The role of religious education in shaping conscience and the extent to which society should protect or challenge such education remains contentious. Looking toward potential solutions, several models have emerged from countries that have successfully addressed this issue. Alternative civilian service programs, amnesty provisions, and dialogue between religious communities and governments have all shown promise in different contexts. The key factors for success appear to include genuine respect for conscience, non-punitive alternatives to military service, and recognition that religious diversity can coexist with civic responsibility. However, implementing such solutions requires political will and social consensus that may be lacking in many contexts. The financial and social support systems within the Jehovah's Witness community for families of imprisoned members demonstrate organizational solidarity, but also raise questions about dependency and autonomy. The community provides material assistance, emotional support, and maintains connection with imprisoned members through letters and permitted visits. This support network helps families survive the absence of breadwinners, but may also create obligations and expectations that influence individual decision-making about conscience and compliance with state requirements. International bodies continue to monitor and report on these imprisonments, with organizations like the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention and various special rapporteurs documenting cases and calling for releases. However, the effectiveness of international pressure varies greatly depending on the target country's sensitivity to international opinion and its economic and political relationships. Some nations have modified their policies in response to international criticism, while others have remained unmoved or even intensified restrictions in defiance of external pressure. The theological debate within Christianity about civic duty and religious obligation provides important context for understanding these imprisonments. Different Christian denominations interpret biblical teachings about authority and conscience differently, leading to varied positions on military service and political participation. These theological differences reflect deeper questions about the relationship between faith and society, the nature of Christian witness, and the meaning of religious freedom in pluralistic societies. The long-term trajectory of this issue remains uncertain, with some countries moving toward greater accommodation of conscientious objection, while others maintain or increase restrictions on religious activities. Technological, social, and political changes continue to reshape the landscape of religious freedom and state authority. The experiences of imprisoned Jehovah's Witnesses serve as a barometer for broader trends in religious freedom and human rights, making their situation relevant beyond their specific community. As we reflect on these 254 individuals currently imprisoned, we confront fundamental questions about the nature of conscience, the limits of state authority, and the meaning of religious freedom in diverse societies. Their imprisonment represents not just a legal or political issue, but a deeply human struggle between conviction and consequence, principle and pragmatism. Whether one views these individuals as heroes of conscience or lawbreakers facing legitimate consequences, their situation challenges us to consider how societies can balance individual freedom with collective needs, religious diversity with social cohesion, and personal conviction with civic responsibility. The resolution of these tensions will shape not only the fate of these particular prisoners, but also the broader future of religious freedom and human rights in an increasingly complex world.